You know, most people, most gamers do their top 10 games of the year sort of lists, which have been appearing everywhere for the past month or so, depending on how long it takes to get this out. That doesn't have anything to do with me at this point because, quite frankly, I don't care too much about getting all the hot new games, because I can get a lot of them way cheaper and sometimes better later anyway. Anyone on a budget has no reason to care about that really. So instead, I think it'd be a fun little project that I made a fun little video about, just the top 10 games I happened to play during the year of 2014. Basically, just any game I played, any amount in 2014, taking a little bit into account what I played, what I continued to play of some of these games into the beginning of this year. I think it's a fun idea, so that's exactly what this video is going to be about. Top 10 games I happen to like, that I happen to play in 2014. Let's start. Number 10. Lone Survivor. Now here's the interesting thing. I'm not particularly interested in most survival horror games. Honestly, the genre just doesn't do much for me. Not particularly spooked by much fiction. And that doesn't change the fact that most of the games I've ever played in the genre just did not control that well. And I know that's an intentional decision, the apparent idea of survival horror is supposed to be this sort of intentionally bad controls, intentional difficulty and awkwardness to just add to the horror of everything and add to the danger you're in when playing it, and I can see some validity in that. However, that's not really my type of thing. It just does not do a lot for me, basically. At least from what I've played of the genre, which is not a ton, but it's been enough. But at the same time, I am very sick of seeing horror games and the like turn into these not very good action titles. And don't even get me started on Resident Evil 6. My god, that game is awful. Just the worst. So, for this Halloween, that was one of the games I decided to play specifically because, hey, it's Halloween, let's play something scary. So this gave me a good chance to play Lone Survivor. I was thoroughly impressed by the whole game from beginning to end. It's not my favorite game in the world, just because of semi-low expectations. I had to put this on the list just for really surprising me. Now, this is a very Silent Hill sort of take on the genre. It has very much of the similar uses of items and the very awkward controls and such, along with just this psychological and just in general messed up sort of horror that just fills the entire game. It's one of those games that makes you question how much of what you're seeing is real and how much of it is just the protagonist losing their mind. And that is really, really interesting to put in a video game. Something I'd like to see more games pull off, to be honest. At least if they could do it as well as this one. Now, perhaps the main reason I enjoyed this one way more than most is because it is in fact a 2D game. Now, it has similar features as other survival horror with its combat. However, because of the 2D nature of it, it's simplified to such a degree that while it feels difficult and challenging in that you can't actually play the game that well, it does it way better than most simply because it's so simple that you're not only are you limited in how you can shoot the enemy, for example, you're also limited in how you can fail at controlling the game, which is kind of brilliant. So that just means, sure, I failed to shoot the enemy, but you can get the general idea on how to do it. It's awkward, but it still works. It still works. It still feels right. And it actually does make the game feel more dreadful. Trying to get through the tougher areas, through some of these horrific enemies, is really, really tense. While there's plenty of other ways to get past them, using, bait, or like just hiding from them, the combat is really the most tense part of the game. Especially the few boss-like encounters that you come across. And I'm really glad that I got to enjoy the genre in such a way, finally. Instead of pretending that Resident Evil 4 is the sole idea of how to do horror well. Now, because this is the director's cut, this game apparently has even more endings than the original version. I personally only played it once and got what I found out was the bad ending, and I feel I don't entirely know what happened in this game. But while that does kind of annoy me, it also does add to almost the point of the game, this sort of confusion and sense of like, what the hell is going on? That even when I beat it, I don't know what happened exactly. And that's kind of cool. So I feel ultimately that's good enough to put it on a list like this. Also, I almost forgot. One of the coolest things is that it actually has a sanity meter, but unfortunately the game doesn't always do the best job at making that obvious. In fact, it's really hidden. I didn't realize it existed until I looked it up. But a lot of your choices do ultimately change what ending you get. And it feels really, really cool. It's the type of game I'd like to go back to in future Halloweens. Try to get the better endings and see what that's like. Maybe I'll finally get some answers. Who knows? On to the next one. Number 9. SteamWorld Dig. Here's another really interesting sort of indie game. This is a game I had heard plenty of good things about, but I had not personally played it last year when it came out. Well, last year, but I mean 2013. But towards the end of 2014, I decided I need to finally play this game. Surprising that it took me this long to get to it, since I'd been actually focusing on playing games on Nintendo's eShop, either on the Wii U or 3DS, to try out some different games. And though sometimes I didn't always make the best purchasing choices, and it did make me regret not really getting into Steam and its incredible sales and never-ending supply of games. But there were some gems, and SteamWorld Dig is definitely one of them. Now, it is a sort of Minecraft-y sort of digging game, but with some elements of, say, Metroidvania, with some interesting upgrades. It's about a little robot trying to dig lower and lower into the ground to find something. Don't remember the exact forgettable plot details. Something about maybe his uncle once dug down there or something. But it doesn't really matter. What matters is, one, Metroidvania games are really fun. And two, digging in games like this, or Minecraft, or Terraria, or what have you, is really addicting. And this is the perfect type of game where you can either just play for a long time, though admittedly, from what I understand, the game's not the longest game either, so you can't dig forever. It isn't literally Minecraft. It is a linear adventure. Downloadable adventure, so it's not the longest game. But it is the type of game you can play as long as you want, or as short of amount of time as you want. One of the main reasons for this is that the game does a really good job at forcing you to go back to the surface in order to upgrade your supplies, upgrade what supplies you can actually get, among other things. And for a game of this size, there's a lot of upgrades. It's very impressive how many upgrades you can get in this game for the many pieces of equipment you get. And it's also impressive how they tied all this digging into the Metroidvania sort of gameplay. Because as the further you dig, you find small caves that are more linear areas instead of this sort of never-ending tiles of ground to just constantly dig into. Like, that's where the more traditional Metroidvania level design comes in, though more linear in those areas. And that's where you usually get either a lot of gems in order to get money to upgrade, or some actual significant upgrades, some of which are optional, like the ability to do a high jump by using some of the water that you find underground, or an upgrade that lets you withstand fall damage, which is very useful when you have to climb back up and then drop down a large distance in order to get back to where you last were. The game does a good job at always balancing different reasons why you'd want to go up. Either you're running out of your light energy, which is how you're able to see that well outside of planting very weak lamps of sorts into tiles on the ground. So you'll constantly have to go back up to refill your solar power, I guess, because it refills from the sun. Or you'll run out of space to carry all the materials and gold that you find, so you have to go back up in order to add it to your maximum amount of gold you've found, which is how you unlock more upgrades in the shops, and then for you to use the money you get to actually buy those items. And while you can die or get stuck, the game does a good job at making sure that probably won't happen more than once or twice. Enough so to keep things interesting, but not enough that it's annoying. It just does a lot of really cool things like that. And it's a really addicting, fun game. Sort of game I like to play for like a few minutes at a time. And it's just really, really good. So yeah, SteamWorld Dig. Number 8. Hyrule Warriors. Oh hey look, a game that actually came out in 2014. What a novel concept. So, here's an interesting thing about this. So because I didn't actually play A Link Between Worlds until this year, again, this year meaning 2014, because we're talking about 2014, even though I'm recording this in 2015. You know. But yeah, I played that game in 2014, and I originally kind of assumed it was probably going to end up on this list because Zelda, but just because I could, I decided to do a second playthrough on Hero Mode, which was possibly a mistake because goddamn that part is hard. But even with the many, many things that game does right, it has actually gone really low on my list of Zelda games. Which obviously means it's still quite good, but even with the many things it does right, it just does so many things I just don't want in a Zelda game. Or just kind of annoying, or just uninteresting. So that bogs down the many good things about the game for me. Now, compare that to Hyrule Warriors, which is a game I went to, at best, cautiously optimistic. Because I had played almost no Dynasty Warriors before, so I didn't know exactly what to get out of the series, but outside of a small niche audience, most people have generally stated that this game series is fairly repetitive and there's just not much to it for a sort of hack and slash game. So I went to this expecting the Hyrule Warriors to just be kinda okay. Some fun fan service, in more ways than one at points, but ultimately to be fairly just okay. Nothing more than that. What I found is a game, while flawed, is something I am eternally grateful exists, especially in this year. There is nothing I needed more than a game that is a giant stress reliever. And oh boy, does Hyrule Warriors deliver in that. For those who don't know, Hyrule Warriors is a spin-off of the popular in Japan, popular nowhere else, Dynasty Warriors series that stuck around for a very, very long time and is infamous for its repetition and lack of innovation. So much of this game is about beating completely useless thugs that can't damage you at all in ridiculous ways, and a large number of these enemies for that matter. While getting to certain bases on battlefields and capture them for your army. Do that, finish some basic missions, maybe fight a boss, and you complete a level. Repeat this 15 times for the story mission, and 15 million times for the entire game, it seems. And in theory, this should be the most boring and insanely repetitive game imaginable, just because of the amount of content versus just how repetitive the gameplay is. And it is. It is repetitive. There's no denying that. It is flawed. It is kind of dumb. But at the same time, it is so relaxing to just constantly destroy enemies with your ridiculous and samey combos over and over and over. And to its credit, the game is not entirely just the same few combos. There is enough variety, like you get some items from the Zelda series, like bombs and the bow and arrow and such, or you can use your 2 different types of special attacks, among other things. So the game actually gets this really, really good balance of being repetitive enough and focused on just looking awesome, more than being a challenging gameplay experience, while still having plenty of elements that are still challenging and require thought and effort. That it hits this perfect zone where you just really enjoy the repetitiveness of it all. It's really hard to describe, honestly, as I've never really played a game quite like this. Closest I can think of is one of those RPGs you really, really love to grind in. It's like that, but in a more action-focused way. That's what I'd compare it to. Just one of those games where it's not the most technically impressive, it's not the most well-made, it's not like something Platinum would make, it's not like Ninja Gaiden worthy, or probably not even God of War worthy. But it's its own thing, and it's something I really kind of needed this year. It is something really addicting, and really fun, and really interesting to me. So I'm glad I played it. It's really good. And as a nice bonus, they could actually animate about 10 or so more female characters than Ubisoft ever could. So, that's a nice bonus, right? I think so. Number 7. Bayonetta 2. Speaking of female characters and controversy, here's Bayonetta. Bayonetta 2 is the sequel to Bayonetta, the extremely beloved action title. Heard multiple action titles, spectacle fighter, whatever you want to call it, that was brought back from the dead, seemingly, thanks to a bizarre deal with Nintendo of all people, which to this day is still funny on some level, to see a company like Nintendo publish a game with one of the most over-the-top sexualized characters in gaming, or for that matter, a very violent M-rated game in general. Though at the same time, that's a bit overstated. Nintendo's done other stuff like this. I mean, Conker's Bad Fur Day was made under Nintendo's watch, and that was like over 13 years ago. This is not that shocking. Seriously, people. Now, this is a game similar to your Devil May Cry's, your God of Wars and such, in that it's filled with a ton of interesting combos to destroy all your enemies with. And it is glorious and fun to do so. And I'm glad I actually like Platinum's games. My first experience with them was Vanquish, a very interesting and at times fun game that was let down by many issues, particularly by being a cover shooter. But between this and the horribly underappreciated Wonderful 101, I totally see why people love this company's games. They are ridiculous, they are over the top, they have some of the most incredibly enjoyable combat you can get in any game, and they're very clearly very replayable. Not to mention this game, and the first game, which, by the way, comes with Bayonetta 2, has some of the most enjoyable and ridiculous boss battles imaginable. Honestly, part of me really wanted to put this even higher on the list. Honestly, it is such a joy to play sometimes that it honestly made me want to put it way, way higher on this list. But ultimately, I'd say about three things prevented that. First one is that this type of game, especially when it's actually challenging, unlike Hyrule Warriors where I could just pop in and enjoy at any time, Bayonetta is something I need to be in the mood to really get into and really fully appreciate the game. Second of all, and this ties into the first one, is I sometimes have difficulty getting into the games that are so focused on memorization of different button combos. And you get a bunch of different combos, and it always changes depending on what equipment you have. So it becomes this weird mix of trying to button mash while also trying to memorize everything perfectly. And it can be just a bit much. But the third thing is probably the real big issue here. Now, despite Platinum games being so good, being almost perfectionists at their type of action-focused gameplay, they also like to put in a pretty good amount of cutscenes and the like. Now, these cutscenes do have their highlights, some generally really goofy and cheesy and funny comedy to it, along with some really enjoyable to watch action scenes and the like. Some of the characters are really enjoyable in their own weird way, especially Bayonetta herself. However, the games, both Bayonetta 1 and 2, also have like a plot and story, and it's
Don't just walk into Fimbulventr. We're going to have to be creative, love, if we're ever going to make it. Look over there. That's the Cathedral of Cascades. It was used for ritual worship of the mountain. Inside, there's a device that can build a bridge to the heavens. It will take us halfway up Fimbulventr. An express pass. Right, love? Inferno? Fimbulventr. Where's Fimbulventr?
You're a Lumen Sage. An infernal?
But more importantly, I'm investigating an old Noah-Toon story, known as The Legend of Aesir.
The Legend of Aesir?
The Legend of Aesir. A struggle caused the Trinity of Realities to be split into three realms: light, darkness, and chaos. Obviously, our world was the one born from chaos. The three worlds all needed rulers, most of all ours. And the one that ruled the chaos became known as Aesir. Aesir spent the first eternity quietly looking upon the earth from his holy mountain, where we only see reality and make it match our rules of the world. Aesir saw through reality, and those visions became our world. These observations became Aesir's power.
Please, no more explaining!
yeah. Number 6. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Now, I was a big fan of platformers, the original Donkey Kong Country, and the last game, Donkey Kong Country Returns. It was pretty obvious I was probably going to put this on the list. But part of me had kind of hoped it was even higher. This might also be the one I have the least to say about, to be honest. It is basically a new Donkey Kong Country Returns. It's very much the classic Donkey Kong Country type of gameplay, a bit slower than Mario, but in some ways actually even better. And despite some of the simplicity and of the old games, they're still genuine classics. They do so many things so well in all of their levels that it's always a blast to play them, especially the second one. And Donkey Kong Country Returns was easily one of my favorite games on the Wii. Like a perfect example of how to bring back a franchise by taking what made it good and then expanding on it based on the technology you have. And it just led to so many good and fun and interesting levels. And that's all it ever needed. Just Donkey Kong Country with a few changes and some more expanded, more visually interesting levels. It did that and it succeeded. And it was brilliant. Nothing short of brilliant. Now, Tropical Freeze is mostly an excellent title. Just another fantastic platformer, which is not too surprising coming from Nintendo, of course. And they even got David Wise, the original composer from the first Donkey Kong Country, back to compose brand new music for the game, which is awesome. Like, the original Donkey Kong Country is one of those games I never owned, but still played at a friend's house and really, really loved. So it is really cool that the series got to be brought back. However, this game, along with returning Diddy Kong, of course, they brought back Dixie Kong and even let you play Cranky Kong to add even more gameplay variety and more replayability to the game, which is a very nice touch. Though because of how much I played Returns, I usually, more often than not, preferred playing as Diddy. Now, the game, like the previous one, does have co-op, but I didn't even bother in this case. Like, I tried Returns co-op for a little bit. It's just not as good as playing single player, quite frankly. The game is made to be a single player game. It was not made for multiplayer. At least I don't think it was. Not from what I played. And not from what I've seen, for that matter. The game's excellent on its own anyway, right? I will say, though, some of the levels really drag on for too long compared to the previous game. They intentionally made them longer because it was much easier to do so on the Wii U rather than the Wii, it seems. And that's cool in a way. It really just felt like levels just lasted too long. Pacing was kind of off compared to the last game, which took a bit of something out of the game. That, and it's less exciting than the last game was, quite frankly. It's pretty much Donkey Kong Country Returns. It doesn't ruin the game or anything like that, but I do think that it ultimately made it less enjoyable for me than the previous one. But again, that's not a bad thing by any means. It's still excellent. That's really all you need to know. An excellent, high-quality platformer that I still really enjoyed. Simple as that. Number 5. Grand Theft Auto 5. Now, they just put this game on PS4 and Xbox One a few months ago, but that's not the version I played. That's mostly because I'm not interested in having consoles that don't have actually interesting exclusives. So this is just a 360 version, and I was way too late to play this game compared to literally everyone else on the planet. But yeah, Grand Theft Auto 5. Like, I'd actually played this game when I was too young to be playing these games, to be honest. Like 3 and Vice City back in the day. And while I found some fun with them, I got bored of them shockingly quickly. I don't know, I'm not exactly sure why at this point. I just had issues by the time I played some Vice City. And a few years ago I tried to play San Andreas, but I quickly lost interest. However, finally with GTA 5, I finally got to see what people see in this franchise. I think I finally get it. I mean, I always kinda got it. The idea of playing, like, this ridiculous criminal and doing horrible, ridiculous things in this open world. I totally get the appeal of that, actually. Especially when it's just fun and ridiculous. I totally get that. But being able to play this one, I really got into it way more than I was expecting to. Which is good. I like playing games and enjoying games that other people enjoy. I don't like being like, Grand Theft Auto, who cares? You know, when millions upon millions of people care. So this was nice. I actually got to fully enjoy one of these games. It's a bit tough for me to explain why this game works so well, but I can think of a few reasons. One is that the gameplay, while not the most compelling or challenging thing in the world, is done incredibly well. It does stuff that, like, other games would be like, okay, or like, I don't care about. Like cover shooting, for example. Most cover shooting in games does not interest me, really. But Rockstar is usually really, really good at keeping it interesting, despite it being pretty easy. Like, I pretty much used auto lock on for most of it, so a lot of the time I was just like, get off cover and then just immediately lock on and shoot the person. Like, And that's not that challenging.
The world is not only
But actually explain some of the scenarios they put in that game. We have to survive these shootouts, or like escape or whatever. It's way more compelling than you'd think.
close to buy.
Because even with such simple gameplay like that,
Nirvana's too
they do a lot to keep things interesting. They do a lot to make sure that you still have a good chance of dying.
hunt and be
So you have to be careful, you have to
freaks to watch
pay attention to your surroundings, know when, which cover to use,
bounties to hunt.
have a good idea of which gun to use, and you're given a lot of variety of weapons to use in those scenarios. And there's a crazy amount of stuff you can do in this game, obviously. Some of which I didn't even go that far into, like,
Mechanics in the game.
you can ride, like, jet skis, you
Every aspect is
buy stocks, you can buy stocks in the video game world. Or you can take flying lessons. Why? Because you can. That's why. It's in the game, so you can do it.
feels fun
And it's really the vehicle controls in particular that I really, really enjoy.
this leisure.
I cannot think of this might actually be some of the best controlled cars in any open world game.
Dangerous
They
things.
just feel really smooth and responsive, and like they do a good job of balancing it being simple and easy to drive, while still requiring skill for like the tougher chase scenes, or to get around the city quickly in general without causing enough damage to get the cops on you.
Then decides
Don't get the cops on you in that game, or you're probably gonna die and lose a lot of money. Not to mention, because it's the open world Grand Theft Auto, you can do a lot of stupid stuff just because it's funny. It's just being a horrible, horrible person. And it's fun in its own weird way. Speaking of horrible people, the game is about horrible people. And that's really what makes it work.
anything from
It's a world of idiots and horrible people, and it knows it. But it keeps you invested because the characters you actually have a reason to care about are either like
there's Grand Theft Auto
character
Online
that basically exists for you to hate them,
soon.
or they expand upon what could have been really, really dumb characters and make them compelling, interesting, three-dimensional dumb characters. Specifically the main characters. The game also has this sort of self-awareness in its story and characters about how hypocritical and ridiculous
Theft Auto 5
and awful
started trying
so much of the series is.
open world game in a number of ways.
And it makes the story so much more compelling than it could have been otherwise. Like, I heard 4 was really bad at trying to make you really sympathize with the characters, even though you can just casually murder people between missions. Like, that stuff doesn't mix well in your story, you know? It just embraces everything good about the series and everything controversial about the series.
And the ridiculous
And I kind of love it for that.
hypocrisy.
You tell me exactly
Not to mention the fantastic licensed soundtrack,
why it cannot be.
which includes a wide variety of like genres and decades of music put into it. Like, if you want to switch between the newest Wiz Khalifa song and then just go straight into Phil Collins music, you can. If you want to go to new electronica,
And now less
or if you want to listen to Eddie Murphy's biggest hit of all things, Party All the Time, you can totally do that.
Franklin.
And honestly, the songs I didn't like as much, or just hilariously awful, somehow added to the game, which is great.
The less said about
There's one scene in particular where they intentionally always play a certain Chicago song,
introducing 3 lead characters
and it adds the atmosphere of that scene to how ridiculous and amusing that scene is. So much,
players can
it is glorious. Not to mention the voice acting. The main characters in particular, the voice acting is really one of the main reasons they are so compelling. They do an amazing job. Especially Trevor and his world of insanity,
to give missions
which is the only way I can describe his character in that game. Fucked up insanity. So yeah, Grand Theft Auto is actually as good
when not
as people say it is.
the use of 3 lead characters
And I'm happy to say
also
that.
allow for a touch of voyeurism. As you can drop in at any moment.
Number 4. Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. It's Smash Bros. It's Smash Bros. With more Smash Bros. For your Smash Bros. Smash Bros. Number 3. Dark Souls. Now here's a game I checked out way too late. This game literally came out towards the end of 2011. Which is fine. If I played a game for the first time that came out in 1993, I probably would have put it on the list if it was good enough, quite frankly. But regardless, if you paid attention to gaming at all in the past few years, you probably know something about Dark Souls. And this is definitely one of those cases where I heard the hype, I heard why people love this game for quite a while. And then I finally played it, and they were entirely right. It's one of the most brilliantly designed games I have played in a very, very long time. In that it could have failed in so many ways with what it tries to do. Now, for those unaware, Dark Souls is a sort of action RPG, I guess you would call it. The focus on the action. Honestly, an action game that just happens to have RPG elements, practically. An insanely difficult game. With very difficult to learn movement and gameplay. While there's truth to all of that, what Dark Souls really is just brilliantly made. Mostly, at least. Now, I'm not as in love with the storytelling, at least at this point, as quite frankly, I'm putting a game on this list that I didn't actually beat yet. Though I certainly planned to, I just got distracted and couldn't get farther in this game than I did. But I got far enough to put it this high, so... I know people love the storytelling, the sense of subtlety and interpretation that's needed to really get anything out of it. And that's all well and good, and this game does it better than a lot of other games. And I'm finding that it doesn't have some cinematic, focused, dialogue, story-driven sort of thing. But that doesn't have a ton to do with me. There's some interesting characters and such. But for me, it's mostly just about this horribly dark and dying world that I am stuck in, and I have to fight these horrific undead creatures and the like. And it's fun. That's what really matters to me in this game. And it is incredibly fun. This is some of the most enjoyable and satisfying combat in any game ever. To put it in my mood, I'm actually put it above Bayonetta, although this is a very different game than Bayonetta. It takes some getting used to, but once you know what you're doing, just everything just feels like has real... The best way I've heard it described, and this is completely true, is that the weapons in particular have weight. Like, you always feel the full weight whenever you use your weapons. So if you use, like, a smaller weapon, there's still, like, this tiny millisecond of delay. And the movement and the animation, everything, that just makes it feel super satisfying to attack enemies. And the fact that the enemies are tough and you have to block and dodge really well only adds to that. And it's just really fun and engaging. Really satisfying. Consider the amount of backtracking I've had to do in the game. It says a lot that the combat didn't get old at any point. Though at the same time, that weight is why I usually don't use the biggest weapons, because they're just way too slow for me to be good at. They're way too slow for me to use them well. But that's a personal choice. You can use a lot of different weapons and items. That makes things interesting, but it's different classes you pick at the beginning. I went with what is apparently the correct choice for newbies, and went with the Pyromancer, I believe. And it takes a lot to tolerate and endure the difficulty of this game. If you're not prepared to die a lot, you might not want to play this game, because the game basically exists to kick your ass just when you're starting to think you're good at the game. So you have to get better at the game until you can kick their asses. And that's great. Annoying at times, admittedly, like in any game when you keep dying. But great. Now the stuff used for this game to upgrade and level up and everything involves getting souls from enemies. And if you die, you lose all your souls, turn back into this zombie-like hollow instead of the human, which is... And you have to do some fairly odd stuff, maybe not explained well. The game is really bad at explaining things, quite honestly. In order to become human again, which is how you get your best stats at human anyway. So you want to stay human as long as possible, which means not dying. But you have to keep dying, because there's no way you're not going to keep dying at this game. So it's a bit of a mess in that regard, but it's very intentional, and it's all designed so well that it works out perfectly. Or close to perfectly, at least. But anyway, if you don't get back to where you died last time, and you die again, all those souls are gone forever, and you can't use them for anything. Once you get used to it, the bosses are the only stuff that more often than not will cause serious issues. At least in my experience. Maybe a couple of the weird mini-bosses you find too. More often than not, eventually the enemies don't become the biggest problem, just enough of a challenge that it keeps you on your toes, as you inevitably go back and forth. I also really like how, one, the world is very connected. It doesn't seem it at first. It seems like, oh, you have two linear paths. But then things start to connect and you find your way back to different parts of the game in different areas. And just the same amount of places you can go from one area to another makes the world very cohesive, I guess. Makes it feel much more like a complete and interesting world than it would have been otherwise. And because the combat stays fun even when backtracking, when you do backtrack, you either have to, or more often than not, when you want to try a different path because the one you're going on has become too annoying and difficult for you. It's still fun. It's impressive to make backtracking like this fun. I could argue that that's a problem still. Still not ideal that I have to backtrack this much. But at the end of the day, the combat and the atmosphere itself is great. If you like the sort of very dark, a fantasy, it's almost like a fantasy version of a post-apocalyptic story. If that sort of thing interests you, this game is phenomenal at that, without a doubt. And there's just so many things this game does that I love. Very natural game design, instead of having to explain things. Though obviously, again, it goes too far in the opposite extreme sometimes. I absolutely love this game. I can't wait to get back to it. Number 2. Shovel Knight. Okay, Shovel Knight. Okay, the interesting thing about this list is that I had a lot of difficulty deciding where to put Shovel Knight in particular. Because it's not only one of the best games of 2014, according to not only me, anyone, basically anyone agrees on this that has played the game. But is maybe not one of the best, but without a doubt one of the most flawless games I have ever played. Everything the game does is really tight, really well designed. It controls great. Gameplay is fantastic, old school, in all the best ways, with minimum to none, mostly none, of the bad stuff. The music is wonderful. The art design, for what it is wonderful. I'd be hard-pressed to think of something that important that's actually wrong with this game. But at the same time, I did feel slightly... It was hard for me to describe, but it was hard. It's hard to put it exactly, but at the same time, the game felt a little too typical. It is very much a throwback to old school platformers. But there are plenty of throwbacks to old school platformers, and I play plenty of old school platformers all the time. So this is just expected of me. In particular, I wanted to put Dark Souls above this, because Dark Souls just feels so much new, to me at least. I know, Demon Souls came out before that, but Dark Souls just feels so new and interesting, whereas Shovel Knight just feels like a really, really, really well-made example of something that's very, very common in indie gaming nowadays. But ultimately, I could not justify putting this over, well, anything other than the game I put number 1, of course. because it is so good. It is just so good. It's one of the only games in recent years I've played more than once. If you at all care about or like the old school platformers of such, you know, your Mega Mans, your Castlevanias, this is one of the most must-own games you need to own right now. It is amazing. From beginning to end, one of the most perfect games out there. Should also mention, since I already mentioned Dark Souls a bunch, this game has this kind of Dark Souls system and was, I think, intentionally inspired by Dark Souls. Because when you die, you lose a good chunk of your money. So you have to go back to the last checkpoint, and then if you don't get the bags of money that drop from where you die, and you die again, that money is gone. And I think that's fitting considering how Dark Souls is all about old school game design. And Shovel Knight obviously is. And both of them all in the best ways. Some of the most enjoyable games I've played in recent years. Even the story, for what it is really, really well done. A lot more than you would expect for what's supposed to be basically an 8-bit platformer. So yeah, Shovel Knight. Buy it. Just buy it. Now. Do it.
Peggy 16.
Number 1. Zero Escape. Virtue's Last Reward. Stuff like this makes me think I should really get into visual novels someday. Closest I've gone is, of course, the Ace Attorney series, which is just brilliant, ridiculous fun. This game is also brilliant, ridiculous, and fun. Not in quite the same ways, and slightly less self-aware. But it is one of the most compelling stories I've ever seen in any game. It is the type of, bold, plot twist driven, well written, tense, exciting, and of course, batshit crazy anime-like story that I personally love. And let's be clear about this. This game is 80% story. This game is its story. It is told extremely well. Thankfully, there is gameplay though, and that gameplay is some really fun, vaguely point-and-click sort of puzzle rooms. They're extremely well done for what they are. And they do add quite a bit to the game. But it is the improvements over the previous Zero Escape game, 999, which is another brilliant game. And the general story that really makes this game top this list. The way it goes through these multiple storylines, the way it goes through keeps you invested in all these characters, and all the improvements they did make over the also kind of brilliant, but also at times unbelievably annoying 999. 9 persons, 9 doors, 9 doors, 9... No one remembers the actual title of that game. Sorry. I'll put the actual title on the screen. Thank you. But yeah, that game had a couple of flaws, and this game fixes all of them, and I love it. And while it feels awkward to say my favorite game I played in the last year was mostly story, I'm kind of cool with that, honestly. Especially since gaming in 2014 was, let's focus on a story instead. That feels kind of fitting, actually. What else does this say? Oh my god, the villain. Not quite the main villain, but probably the most memorable villain. Zero Jr. My god, he is one of the most... While he's criminally underutilized outside of early sections of the game, he's one of the most just entertaining villains I've seen anywhere, ever. And the fact that all the other characters, more often than not, really are not completely overshadowed by that early brilliant performance. Or, for that matter, overshadowed by the crazy storyline, summed up how good the storytelling in this game is. And yeah, just think it's the best game I played in the past year. It's as simple as that. It's not the best game I've played. Honestly, this is, for a best game of the year, this is very low, honestly. But it's still absolutely fantastic, and the series needs more love. And hopefully, we'll finally get that conclusion with the final game in this series. So that was my list. This was just a fun little video to make. Interesting way to actually do something with actual effort for like editing and the like, and actual commentary. I personally hope you enjoyed this. I personally hope this gets more than like 10 views or so. Like if it reaches like 30 or so, 30 to 50, I'd be fine with that at this point. But whatever. I do hope you enjoyed it. See you later.